My name is Fred Sanchez, and today's day is Thursday, September the 30th, 1993. Our interview today is with Mr. Chet Eisenhauer from
Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Kenosha, Wisconsin. He was a guard with the 305th Military Police Escort Guard here in the States during World War II. We will be discussing his experience as a guard. Mr. Eisenhower, can you please begin first by telling me what you did, where you lived prior to enlistment?
I was an 18-year-old kid who quit high school and joined the Army in March 1943. Went to Fort Sheridan in Illinois for disbursement, and became one of 21 replacements for the 305th Escort Guard Company, and was later sent directly to Aliceville, Alabama.
Can you continue a little bit with a brief description of your military career prior to coming to Aliceville?
Well, there really wasn't any military career. We were just recruits who had joined the Army. I spent about 2 weeks at Fort Sheridan, where it was extremely cold, expecting to go into a armored division, since I'd had experience in motorcycle repair as a kid and drove Harleys. In fact, I left a 3861 overhead at home. And by fate, they needed 21 replacements for what later turned out to be the 305th MPEG company. And I was one of those persons, and that changed my whole future.
And when did you say you were assigned?
We left Fort Sheridan, 21 of us, on a train heading south to a destination that we had no idea where we were going. Probably the third week in May of 1943. Heading south, stopped in Memphis, Tennessee, and then continued on to Aliceville and got off a train in the middle of the night, approximately the third week in May of 43.
How old were you at the time?
I was 18 years old.
When did you become aware that you were to serve as a guard for prisoners of war?
When we got into Aliceville the next morning when we woke up, which was probably maybe a little earlier in May. When we woke up in the camp and I saw all of the soldiers around me falling out full of sawdust, I looked around and saw the camp, which appeared to be some type of prisoner camp, although it wasn't finished, and I realized that apparently I was in some type of prisoner of war camp, although it wasn't finished, and we helped to build it then.
Did you receive any kind of special training for this assignment?
Well, that was the training that really, ultimately, this was the training that we got for our real destination, which was to go overseas. I didn't realize it at the time, but the training that we received down there was a combination of infantry training and learning to work with guarding and what we call chasing prisoners, which was going out with them on work details, and learning the language, learning the necessary words, pretty much learning what we ultimately were going to do when we got overseas during the war, or into the war, rather.
So let me follow up by saying, were you eventually sent to Europe?
Oh, yes. Our company was, we were in Aliceville until I think it was early in December of 43, and we were the first company in Aliceville. We brought in the first prisoners, the African Corps prisoners. I think it was June 2nd of 1943, and those were the prisoners that we learned to work with. Then in December, our company shipped up to Fort Custer, Michigan. We kind of went about it backwards. A lot of MPEG companies trained at Custer first, but our company was a regular Army company over in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. So we kind of went backwards. So we got up into Michigan, and we were in Michigan from December until March of 1944, at which time we were weeded out and straightened up and sharpened up, did a lot of overseas training, combat training, and then we went overseas in, I think we left Boston Harbor somewhere in March of 1944. And then we were in April, in May, in early June, we were in England, and then we went into Normandy shortly after D-Day.
Did you request, is this something that you as an individual requested to be a member of an MPG unit? Or,
Certainly not.
so you were assigned then?
Yeah, I was assigned. It was just a matter of chance. I think the whole Army was a matter of chance unless you happened to have some type of influence maybe. But for most of us, it was just a matter of luck or bad luck. With me, it was lucky.
As part of this overall training to go overseas, were you told what to expect as far as, for example, the German culture and behavior? And
We were told, I believe, to be quite negative about the Germans. I believe that we were kind of told to expect the worst, and maybe at that time it was necessary. Although later on we realized, as we captured prisoners, we realized that they were human just like us. I have a little story I can tell you if you want to hear it. On the ship going over seas, it took us about 18 days. We went over in a convoy. And on the ship in the morning, Sunday mornings, they would have church services. And there would be Jews, a Jewish rabbi. There would be usually a Lutheran minister and maybe a Catholic priest, usually in the service. And they gave us a talk. And what they usually told us was that God was with us. And this is what most of the men, I think, felt. And they, of course, told us some of us wouldn't be coming back and this type of thing. And we were doing it for God and country. And the irony of it came up was when we got into Normandy and we captured our first German prisoners, we noticed that every infantry man had a belt buckle that said, "God meant us," which really means God's with us. And it was my first realization that there's something wrong here. God couldn't be with both of us. And my first reaction was, how does he make this determination of which one of us is going to survive? Now that's the way it was. And I've kept that story with me for years and have repeated it many times. Yeah. And so that was maybe a little answer to your question. But as you got into an individual discussion with prisoners and so on, you realize that they were just a stereotype of yourself. They were there because they had to be, and you were there because you had to be. And we were far removed from the reasons for the war.
Was there an official designation to Camp Aliceville?
When I went down, it was called Aliceville Internment Camp. And later on, as you may hear from someone else, it was later called, I can't remember what the name is, Prisoner of War Camp at Aliceville or something like that.
No number?
Oh, I'm sure there were, and I think you can find that out maybe from someone who knows more specifics. Yeah, I'm sure it must have been documented with a number or so on. It was rather a large camp, and the potential there was great. One of the things that I feared was being stuck there. And if you want a little another antidote that I have for the moment was, I later on after the war started reading some books about prisoners of war camps. And I found that prisoners of war were treated more harshly as they got back further from the front. When you first got them, as we did, you treated them as kind of comrades in arms, kind of corny, but it was true. And you sort of respected their condition and their personal belongings and stuff quite a bit. As I understood it, the further back they got, the more harshly they were treated. And when they finally got back to the camps in the States as the war went on, I hate to use the word limited service, but apparently by that time, the troops guarding many of these camps were more or less limited service troops. And apparently, a lot of these people, as some of these prisoners of war books later brought out, a lot of these troops were frustrated by what happened to them, because it probably wasn't much to tell your grandchildren that you spent 2 or 3 years guarding prisoners in Aliceville or Texas or somewhere. And so there seemed to be a certain bitterness that I guess a lot of them took out on the prisoners. We were fortunate, really fortunate. I thought when I first got to Aliceville I was stuck in the hinterlands of Alabama. But it turned out that we did get, to be a first-class outfit and went over and handled hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the war.
You mentioned earlier that when you first got here, the camp was not really constructed.
No.
What preparations had to be done to accommodate and receive the prisoners? How did you help in the construction and all that?
Well, what we did is we actually went out and worked on some of the sawmills and cut lumber and so on, and to help the engineers with a certain amount of construction. But that actually wasn't for too long. Then when the prisoners came here, I'm sure, in fact I can say, that they helped to build their own camp. They worked in the sawmills, and most of them were delighted to do this. They were skilled, and there are people more knowledgeable than I am that went on at the camp, pardon me, after we left.
How was when you're talking about you leaving, was the 436, were they the unit that replaced you?
They didn't really replace us. The 436 came there after us, not too long after us, and they stayed there longer. I can't remember when they left. Another interesting thing was, at least as far as I was concerned, and most of my buddies, we really didn't associate much with other companies. You pretty well had your own company, and we had a unique appearance because being a former cavalry outfit, we wore the Boy Scout type campaign hats. So anybody from the 305th was recognizable by their Boy Scout type hats. And for some reason, we took a lot of pride in this. And no, I can't really say that I knew one person in the 436th. You sort of kept to yourself. And it was sort of because of your duty, the way things worked. You'd be on guard duty 1 week, tower duty 1 week, interior guard duty 1 week, and training 1 week. You really didn't cross paths, except maybe in the PX.
Can you please describe the camp as best as you can recall, barracks, kitchens, bathrooms, recreation rooms, education rooms?
Well, it's pretty basic. Everything was tar paper type shacks, cracks in the floor, as I recall. Where we lived, there were coal stoves, I believe, one on each end. It was in Alabama, so you really didn't need a whole lot of heat. I remember there were wooden walks that we built that had water mock or snakes beneath them. The camp was pretty expansive. Psychologically, we kind of drew a difference between where we lived and where the soldiers ultimately lived. The only thing that we shared really was the hospital. If we had to go get dental work or hospital work, then we had to go into the camp and get it done at the camp hospital. It was rather, to say, simple, very simple construction, very basic construction, obviously not made to last. Being in Alabama, I think it served pretty well for what they needed.
So to understand you correctly, the barracks for you as the guards were actually outside the fence compound?
Yes. Yeah, there was a double fence, and there were 10 towers, and that was called tower duty. Maybe I didn't mention that before. You pulled tower duty 1 week out of the year. At night, you'd walk between the towers, or you'd be up in the towers with a .30 caliber machine gun. You'll hear this, I'm sure, from everyone you talk to up there.
Do you remember what the size of the entire compound was?
I think it was 400 square acres. The actual prisoner of war compound. I'm not sure if that counted the camp where we were. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Can you go briefly again into the fencing? And obviously, we're very familiar with, in all camps from Andersonville to camps out in Europe, you talk about the double fence line, your outside fence and then your dead line, the guard towers. Can you describe that a little bit more for me?
Well, I think we had an outside, I guess the fence was about 10 feet high with some type of barbed wire on top. And as you just said, maybe 10 feet inside or so was a no man's land. And then, yes, there was an area of approach where if you went beyond that, you were warned to stay back. Floodlights covered all this area, and the machine guns were traversed to cover these areas. If anyone was beyond the warning line, I think they were in danger of being shot. When we were down there were prisoners killed. I think there were 2 killed when I was down there. Our company wasn't on duty. In fact, I was watching a movie one night in heavy rain when we heard the machine gun fire. In fact, the movie was back to Patton, as I remember, or Patton. And but it was pretty typical of what you see in movies and so on.
Was this second fence, the deadline, was that a physical fence like the first one? Was it just a railing?
Oh, no, these fences, each fence was equal to the other, and I think they were at least I would say every bit of 10 to 12 feet high with some type of obstacles on the top. And then inside the camp was a dead line where you shouldn't approach either fence.
That particular deadline, how did the prisoner know how close not to get to the second?
Well, I think that wasn't our job. I think that was there was a whole company or two that were assigned simply to running the camp. And I'm sure they were told that this is what you do. Not only were they told by us, but I'm sure that since they ran, they ran their own camp, the Germans, and I'm sure they were told by their own leaders. As I remember it, Aliceville was a non-commissioned officers' camp as time went on, which made them a little more elite.
Right.
And I think they were more prone to follow the rules and to listen to orders. Yeah.
Can you describe a brief description of the organizational hierarchy, under what command you fell under, some of the things that you were just talking about the camp?
You mean the prisoner camp or
yourselves?
Myself? Well, actually, being an 18-year-old kid, I didn't really know much about the hierarchy, and having been in the Army only a month or two, a couple of months, maybe, we had a captain, and we had a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant. We had 4 squads, and we had a buck sergeant in charge of each squad, and they were God. You were scared stiff of them, and that was pretty much what it was.
How many total men were there in the unit?
135.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned
enlisted men and 3 officers.
You mentioned earlier that there was actually a unit that was responsible for kind of the interior command
Yes.
of the camp. So what was the 305th's main responsibility?
Our main responsibility was guarding and chasing prisoners, making sure they didn't escape, making sure when they went out on work details, cutting lumber, picking cotton, various things like that. We guarded them. It was to learn how to handle yourself around German prisoners. That's what it was.
Do you recall when the first prisoners arrived? Were there already prisoners here when you came?
No, we brought the first Africa Corps prisoners, and our company brought them in from the station in Aliceville on June 2nd, I think it was 1943. We marched them in.
So where did they come from?
They came from somewhere in a camp in the east, if I'm not mistaken.
So they were already here, and they were just being transferred from
Yeah.
one camp to another.
To my knowledge, yes.
And most of these were Africa Corps.
All of them were.
All of them were.
Mm-hmm. Africa Corps prisoners. Very, very, very trained combat, experienced soldiers. And they talked to me, and they treated me like a father, and they told me not to go overseas, to try to keep out of the war, to try to avoid anything I could do, that there was nothing exciting about it, that your life was more important than risking it. They were very concerned that something might happen to us if we went overseas. It was very interesting.
You mentioned about it being an officer's camp. Was this an officer's camp from the very beginning?
No, I think that took place later. I believe when we got the first prisoners, there was more of a mixture. And I think later on they moved anybody below a certain class, non-com class, to different camps, as I remember it now. Some of this I learned after I'd left there.
Was there any type of interrogation, either formally or informally, of the prisoners when they first arrived here at Aliceville?
Well, I think the interrogation most likely took place from day one when they were captured over in Europe, in terms of what their ranks were and what they knew and if they were Nazis and that type of thing. And then I believe as they went along, this dwindled off. But I would guess as they eventually got down to Aliceville, there was still some concern. I can't go into detail on this, but apparently there were accusations of murder and some arguments re Nazism versus conservatism and this type of thing. There were some deaths, I guess, in the camp. There's still debate today whether or not it was murder or not, these types of things. I'm sure other people can enlarge on that a little bit. An interesting sidelight, when we were down there, this Japanese infantry division that was so well decorated fighting in Italy, I think it was the 432nd, if I'm not mistaken, or 434th. 442nd, exactly, the Nisi troops. They came down when we were down there, and they were there when we were there, and they took troops out to pick peanuts in Georgia. And I got to meet a few of those soldiers before they left to go
So they
overseas.
temporarily served as guards too?
Yes, they came in and out and took prisoners out. We've got pictures of them.
And they took them from Aliceville down to Georgia?
I think to Georgia, I think sure it was to pick peanuts, as I remember. And I've got,
Georgia had a lot of camps during World War II.
I think so, yeah. And I've got some pictures showing their bumpers with 442nd Infantry on them.
I mean, just a little sideline thing.
Sure.
You'll be amazed how many people do not realize, even people of your generation, that were your age during World War II, do not recall. We have an exhibit in the museum that talks about German, Italian, and of course very few Japanese were held in this country. Most people do not even know that we held. And we held almost over 600,000 men.
Exactly. You're so right, because out here in the lobby of this Holiday Inn, I just mentioned to this young lady why we were here, and she lives 50 miles from Aliceville, and she said, oh, I never knew that. And we hear this constantly. In fact, I went back, as I told you earlier, to Aliceville, I think the early 70s, late 60s. And I'm going to say that I kind of tried to get a few of the people there that were still alive in those days to recognize how big this heritage was for Aliceville, the biggest thing that ever happened to them. And a few people recognize this, most of whom are dead now, and others kind of fell on deaf ears. And in 1976, I was able to give them some of my photographs to put in their bicentennial paper. I'd like to think, with a little pat on the back, that I kind of helped to start a little bit of a feeling that they better start to recognize, the value of their heritage, because this is the biggest thing ever happened to this town. And it was very interesting. To me, it was my beginning of my association with the South. I had never been away from my hometown of Kenosha, Wisconsin before this. It was interesting. And ever since then, I've had an appreciation of the South and Southern hospitality.
You mentioned a hospital. What types of medical services were provided to the prisoners?
They had a full range of surgery and dental work. I had fillings that I still have today put in 1943 with dentists. And I would say it was a full hospital. There were nurses, and I don't know what the...
They were afforded very well medical.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, I think that they were given, in fact, to just add another little bit of a note here, the prisoners ate much better than we did. When we'd go out on work details called chasing prisoners, as I said earlier, we would have a little brown paper bag with a couple of homemade bread dried out sandwiches with some cheese in it that was starting to turn and so on. And the prisoners would shake their head at us and indicate we should throw it away. And they came out with larger lunches because there were more of them. And they had fresh fruit and so on, and we would eat with them. Yeah. So anyone, they ate better than we did, I'm sure, or at least as good.
This would be a good time to jump into that. Can you describe the living conditions of the prisoners, and of course the guards? Typical day, wake up, meals per day.
Right.
What they have for breakfast, lunch, dinner, that kind of stuff.
Well, I think they had their own German military behavior. I'm not quite sure what. I think they had reveille and so on and so forth, much as we did. I think they kept their military strictness at all times. The Germans wanted this. I believe this helped them to exist, to keep this feeling of still being, worthwhile and being soldiers. Without this, I think they'd be lost. I believe that I can't say specifically what they had and so on. I think you'll have to talk to someone else about the types of food and so on and so forth. I really didn't get into, we didn't get into camp proper. We got the prisoners at the main gate, and then we would take them over and take them out on details. That was it.
Do you know where they were allowed to ride home or receive letters or packages from home?
I would say yes, but I was not in on that. But from my knowledge, yes, they rode home and received packages. Because I've talked to prisoners at our reunions since then, and they've told me that.
Was there any types of recreational activities?
Yes, they were great soccer players. They had a soccer field. I think they took part in many athletics and sports. These were very, very well-conditioned young Afrika Korps prisoners, more or less the elite of the German army, and I think they were very athletic and very talented. In fact, I might make a comment here, another comment that I said at one of the previous reunions back in '89. Being a young, untrained new soldier, I felt extremely self-conscious when we brought him in from the train in June of 1943, where we stood with these guns with bayonets and so on them, something that I had no real experience in using. And I watched these bronzed, tanned combat soldiers get out of this train, and I felt to myself a little ridiculous. And I kept a respect for these soldiers all the time that they were there, that we were there. They'd been through a hell of a lot. And so to this day, I always felt a little self-conscious about the day they got off the train. But later on, in all fairness to our company, we got experience too over in the war, and we got toughened up, and so I kind of redeemed ourselves later on.
I've read about some of the education that was given to them, even to the point of some actually getting college diplomas. Can you?
No, I don't know much about that. You have to remember, again, that we left there in December before the camp really started to grow. And I'm telling you things now that I knew from the time in the beginning, which was very important in the beginning. But as far as the really ongoing activities in the camp and what they ultimately got into, you'll have to talk to some other people who are more experienced about that. We as I say, we went overseas, and we got into the business of just plain getting prisoners up at the front and bringing them back, and that was about it. Watching out for our neck.
Do you remember any religious activities? Do they? You hear a lot about in a lot of the interviews that we do of American POWs, the significance of the religion, their beliefs, their faith.
Well,
and God was very strong and got him through. You know, obviously there's no comparison in the ordeal. We know that already for a fact. But do you know of any?
Well, I can make one comment on that. I really didn't get into religion. I think people pretty much had a right to do what they wanted to do. But I did recognize one thing happening somewhere during the war, shortly after we were capturing prisoners during the fighting, that many of them wore crosses. And I asked them, you got a cross? And I come from a town that's very Catholic. Kenosha, Wisconsin is a very Catholic town. And I said something to the effect, are you Catholic? And they said, yes, they were. And you asked me earlier, you know, what did I know about religion or something, and I'd sort of thought as a high school student that the Catholic Church has been burnt and the priests had been banned and so on. Well, I learned this wasn't true then. Apparently these soldiers' families were still practicing Catholic religion, and they were Catholics. And so it kind of was another one of these eye-opening things. So my answer to that is, in terms of religion, I didn't find anyone who felt they were oppressed.
Can you give us a little more details? You mentioned, of course, one of your primary job responsibilities was going out on these work details.
That was Aliceville, yeah.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about, going out, the types of details they did? You know, what were your responsibilities?
Well, our responsibility was to make sure we got them back to camp that night, every one of them. That was the main thing, and I suppose to a certain extent to make sure they did some work, which I don't think we cared a great deal about. It was hot. It was summer down here in Aliceville, and I guess our job was to make sure that we got them out there and they did a little work and we got them back. In fact, many a times we did the same thing. I picked cotton along with them sometimes. In retrospect, I've often looked back and told my wife, both in the States and overseas, there were times when I wondered if I wasn't sometimes too lax in some of the guarding because of the relationships we had with them. Just fortunately, we didn't get someone who was, well, maybe wanted to get us. Because I think on a work detail, had someone really wanted to get away, they could have done it. Interestingly enough, and I've never understood this, one or two of the prisoners that were killed were trying to escape through those fences you referred to earlier. I think if they really wanted to escape, a work detail was the way to do it. My God, they were out in cotton fields, they were out in the woods. I never understood why those prisoners that tried to escape from inside the camp didn't do it outside.
What was the various types of details that they went out to work in?
Cotton picking with the Japanese, peanut picking, with us cutting trees in the lumber in the sawmill, which was adjacent to the camp, just on the west side of the camp. That was pretty much it.
Basically agricultural or the sawmill.
Yeah, yeah, building.
Were they allowed to form, I know that you don't talk about the camp inside, but do you know of any form of organizations that were allowed to form? For example, a good example of that, I know that by some of the reading that I've done, for example, men that were captured later on, that were maybe members that were SS troops, came back and formed that. Did they form into groups?
I think that the monotony of being confined created certain situations where they might have gotten into smaller groups and had differences of opinion amongst themselves. What they were called, whether or not they did it on the basis of SS or it might have been one of the reasons they made the camp just non-com camp, to kind of take away this friction between the sort of elite, because non-coms in the German army were rather high. They were kind of akin to officers almost. But as far as specific groups goes, I don't know the names of them, but I think you were right. There were certain groups that were formed. I think the monotony of being in the camp created tensions. I'm a psychologist, and in retrospect, again, I often wondered why this didn't drive some of these guys crazy. And I think, this is going to sound kind of strange, but I think the egotism of the German soldier helped them to survive. They weren't going to bow down to people who guarded them. They never lost most of them, their feeling of worth or their pride. And I believe that's why most of the prisoners really survived. That's my own personal opinion. They never really saw us as being superior. Yeah. And so that may not be the answer to your question, but I think there was, certainly this was some of the problem. And I think they answered it by simply German pride.
How would you describe the overall treatment that the prisoners received in the hands of you, the 305th?
Very good. Excellent. As far as I was concerned. Again, there may have been a few, there have been incidents brought up where there may have been an individual who may have treated them badly. But remember, going back to what I said earlier, this may have changed as the type of guard changed. Remember, when I went in and we went in, we were new people hoping that we would be growing in the service and doing something and going somewhere, more young and becoming active soldiers. Later on, when I think these people were destined to limited service, I think they may then have been more abusive to the prisoners. And some of the literature, I think, backs this up. So, you couldn't get a prisoner who just came through a terrible shelling and so on and pick this guy up and treat him badly. He just didn't do it because he was as afraid as you were. But when you get down to Aliceville, way far away from everything, and someone who had, and you got to remember that the people in the States, and this is going to sound corny, but I found it out very true, never really identified with what the war was. It just never happened. Sure, people bought bonds. They made big money. They couldn't spend it anywhere, and they invested it in future savings. I've never been overly impressed with the newsreels and the World War I propaganda and so on as I got older about the sacrifices. Just the other day I read where all the aluminum was collected in the United States was never picked up by the government because it couldn't be used in aircraft industry. It was later sold back to the manufacturers to make, well, guess what? Pots and pans. Well, you get older, you look back at this, and you get a little different opinion of stuff. Yeah.
Obviously, by listening to you, there was a very close relationship with the prisoners. Did you personally become friendly with anybody in particular? Or?
No, we never were with them that much. I did have an incident, though, back in Germany, which I still think about. There was a shelling one night, and in the early morning, the prisoners started drifting through our lines, so to speak. Now, remember, there were no such things as fences in a war. They just started walking in our direction. And we started gathering a few of these up, and they were quite what we call shell-shocked, purple, blue, and so on. And I gathered a few of them up, and a German medic came over to me and asked if he could help with their prisoners. And I said, of course you can. And he whipped out of his pocket a picture of himself in his German uniform and wrote on the back of it, "To my American friend." And he signed it, and I'd still got that picture. And as years have gone on, it's become more and more important to me in my attitude about the senselessness of war and the fruitlessness of war. And I'll go on recording here to say I was an active protester against the Vietnam War and any war following that. I find that nothing sensibly can be settled by killing. We spend all of our lives trying to save mankind through medical process and then shred them to death with artillery shells and so on. It's just appalling, and people who may have seen this would never want it. I can't believe that any of our military leaders have experienced this who would want us to still get into further wars. A little politics here, you can cut it out if you want.
Do you recall the camp rules or rules that were given to the prisoners? Particularly as it affects you that were involved more in the work details than anything else?
Well, I would only guess that the rules were that they had to adhere to what we told them to do when we picked them up at the camp gate. That they would be guarded by us, and that what we said was it. That what we said they had to do. That's all. It was really rather simple. It wasn't that complicated.
In Andersonville, the prisoners, when they went on work details, had to sign a parole.
No.
You know, did that occur?
Not to my knowledge. I think that no. They may have inside the compound before they left, but I doubt it very much. I'd never heard that.
It was a straightforward, open the gate, walk out, guard
Sure.
them, take them to, put them in trucks.
Yeah. Trucks or quite a bit of marching. We'd march. We'd get, I'd say about 30 prisoners to 4 guards. Just a quick guess, something like that. And we had shotguns, and which were in 00 buckshot, which was the most threatening. And it's surprising, not surprising, but interesting that these combat hardened Afrika Korps soldiers respected shotguns with 00 buck. Because I don't know if you know much about 00 buck, but it's 9 pellets to a shell, and it could do a lot of damage at short range, much more effective than a rifle or anything like that.
Did you, as guards, when you went on these details, were you all given permission to shoot a prisoner if he tried to escape?
Yes.
Are you aware of any of the details, any other of the guards that shot a prisoner trying to escape?
I'm only aware through the history, and I think you could maybe ask E.B. Walker more about this later. There was a story where one of the guards, I think in the 489th or some later company, shot a man. The story is, it's in this booklet you can read, that he shot him because his brother had been killed somewhere in combat overseas. Supposedly the story isn't true, but it was passed around. Another soldier apparently was attacked by a German who threw gravel in his face or something to that effect. The ones that were killed when I was here back in early '43, I think it was 2 of them. They were trying to escape on one rainy night, as I recall. And they were buried here in Alabama, and later I think their bodies were sent back to Germany or taken over to McClelland to be buried. I think they're over at McClelland to be buried. Yeah. Considering the number of prisoners here and so on, I think that was small, the amounts. Yeah. They weren't going to go anywhere.
That's right.
Yeah.
Can you recall the forms of punishment that were used to make the prisoners comply to either the outside rules or camp rules?
No. I think that was the German army discipline within the barracks. To my knowledge, there was nothing they could do under our command. I suppose if they tried to hit one of us or something, maybe there'd be something, but I don't recall that happening. I'm sure that if they did anything wrong, it would be brought to the attention of their officers, and they would take care of it. They pretty well ran themselves.
We already kind of briefly talked about as far as what we heard in this country of a mistreatment of American POWs in Germany and in the Pacific. Do you remember where there was any malicious treatment of some of these guards in order to kind of, quote, take it out on them as a result of what was happening to our men?
Well, I kind of talked about that earlier, where some of the men might have been a little bitter by being stuck in the back roads or back woods of the war. You know, I don't think I'd be very happy. I wouldn't be here today if I'd spent, 3 years down in the backwoods of Alabama, for example. And I do believe that some of the stories about prisoners of war allude to or talk about some of the guards being rather hard on or tough on prisoners. My experience was no, but I was in the game much earlier, when that attitude wasn't around. But as I say, I'm only going with some of the reading I've done about prisoner of war camps in America, which alluded to some of the bitterness that was taken out on soldiers, on prisoners, probably 40. Remember, I was gone early in 44, and we had all of 44 and 45 where these prisoners were stuck in these camps.
Were prisoners allowed outside the compound other than the work details?
Later on, as I understand it, and again, you'll have to document this maybe with some other people you interview, but as I understood it, I guess they did do some work around some of the homes and stuff later on, cut grass, and had limited leaves. Now, when I was in England prior to the invasion, there were Italian prisoners who were walking up and down the streets of England. I think they were. Now, I'm up from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and during the war, I learned later, we had many, many German soldiers up there harvesting crops and so on, and I think the coverage or the guarding was very liberal. In fact, there's a story out by Christy McNichols on TV, a documentary called The Summer of My Soldier. You ever heard of it?
As a matter of fact,
yeah.
We used to have a film series at Andersonville in the summer, and we've shown that a number of times.
Yeah, that would kind of give you an idea what it was like up around some of the smaller communities during the war, where these people were literally farmed out to do work. And I don't recall any.
That film was filmed in Georgia.
Was it? Yeah. Well, that'll give you an answer to that they really didn't try to get away too much. Yeah.
Were there any civilians that were allowed inside the camp?
Oh, yeah.
To deal with the Germans? And
I don't know what they did in the camp, but civilians were in the camp. Yeah. In fact, I think the hospital, other than maybe some of the doctors and dentists, were probably civilians. The nurses, the clerical help, all of these people. Many of the engineers, I'm sure, that went in and worked on whatever, the mechanics of the camp were. I'm sure they were all civilians. Many civilians built the camp, by the way. Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot to the daily logistical running of a camp like this. Who ran the camp? Was this done by civilians or military?
The military, I think, had command of the camp, but the civilians had a great deal to do with the everyday going on of the camp. Mm-hmm. Where one began and the other ended, I can't say, but civilians were all over the place. They built a camp with the Army engineers telling what to do.
Obviously, we know already by talking that you were not here at the end of the war, but later on, or in times that you have had a chance to have reunions, do you have any insights to what happened at the end of the war, as far as where the men were taken from here, released, etc.?
No, the only insight I have is that not too many years ago we started meeting with some of the ex-prisoners of war, and they filled us in on their experiences. And as you will learn in talking with some of the ex-prisoners of war, most of them have positive things to say about their treatment in this country. I have not heard anything to the contrary. They were treated pretty good, I think.
I want to ask you a little bit about after you left here. But as far as the camp here, are there any other thoughts, anecdotes, stories that you can recall that you would like to share with us?
Well, you kind of catch me there because it would take a little thinking. There were a lot of funny things that happened to us as soldiers, when I first got down here as an 18-year-old kid, they brought in a USO show, and I didn't realize it when I went to this show. And of course, the camp commandant and his wife and everyone were there. And I sat near the front, and I didn't realize they were all pointing at me when the USO shows. There were red, white, and blue shows, and as I recall, red was Bing Crosby and so on, white was mediocre, and blue were local talent. This was a blue show. And as I recall, they were all pointing at me, because I was kind of a really youngish-looking kid. And they made me go up on the stage and dance with some of these semi-hardened USO girl dancers and put on bras, strainers for a bra, rolled my pants up with skinny legs, put a grass skirt on me, and a wig, which was a mop, and I had to do a hula dance in front of the whole damn camp. And I guess after that, everything came easy. But that did happen to me here, yeah. We didn't get too much. There was not much to do in Aliceville. There were so many of us soldiers, and coming late, the engineers had been here and so on. They'd kind of made friends with everybody. The blacks, they were off in the distance. You didn't see or have much to do with them. That was 1943. Other than silly experiences, we had a lot. They brought in 3.2 beer because some of the guys were getting drunk. And Pickens County, by the way, is a dry county. It still is today. So they allowed us to have 3.2 beer. And it just took some of the old vets to drink more to get just as drunk, if that means anything. But those were a few of the experiences. I was kind of surprised that I, never having been away from home, adapted so well. And I attribute it to the fact that there were some older guys in this company who kind of fathered me rather than going in a young outfit where we're all insecure. Never smoked a cigarette in my life, and partly because these guys just kind of discouraged me. So I feel rather fortunate to this day that I didn't end up in one of these newly developing companies as a young kid where I maybe had to live up to my peers and so on. So I kind of attribute a little bit of going into an older outfit with some good fatherly advice. Those are a few things that I recall.
And obviously this was, as you say, a short existence here in Aliceville. You obviously spent a lot more time in Europe.
Yeah.
Can you go on to a little bit into that, as far as when you left here, where'd you go, some of the duties? You talk about, taking the prisoners, for example, like you mentioned a little while ago, one of the prisoners that was already, I guess you were mentioning you were already in Germany at the time. What were some of the duties? How did you end up? What were the things that you all did after you left here?
Well, we very briefly, we went by troop train to Fort Custer to get overseas training and to get our outfits sharpened up. They weeded out about, I'd say a third of it and brought in new guys. Incidentally, from barrage balloon outfits out in the West Coast when the threat of Japanese invasion was over, we got a bunch of guys from the barrage balloon outfits. And then we trained up there, and ironically enough, we'd been down here in Alabama in one of the hottest summers they ever had, and the southern people laughed at us, and we took them back up to Michigan. Of course, I'm right up from Wisconsin, and they went into one of the coldest winters we ever had, so we got even. We left there in March '44 and went to Camp Miles Standish in Taunton, Massachusetts, and there we got the final sharpening up and so on. And we left Boston Harbor, I'd say somewhere towards the third week in March, if I'm not mistaken. Sailed straight across to sea in a convoy. Took us about 18 days. We were on a ship called the James Parker. It was actually a converted USS Panama banana boat, Caribbean cruise boat, which I later learned made us seasick because it had a round bottom on it. And I got semi-seasick. Well, I took quite a bit. Got over, docked in Bristol Bay. Met the first foreigners I ever met, which were English Cockneys. Couldn't understand a word they said. Got on a train, went somewhere into a place called Morton-in-the-Marsh, and found out we had to go to Burton-on-the-Hill. And we had our full complement of uniform on, which was long underwear, ODs, combat jacket, overcoat, helmet, M1, pack. And lo and behold, being one of the smallest guys in the outfit, they handed me the company typewriter to walk up the hill. Walked about 2 miles up this hill to a place called Burton-on-the-Hill, and we're told that we could not cut any lumber, any wood, or anything else, and got up to these ice-cold barracks. And we stayed up in there for quite a while. guarding American prisoners occasionally, which I referred to earlier, rapists, murderers, and so on. Had incidents such as food poisoning, spent time over in Stratford-on-Avon, saw a couple of plays in the Shakespeare Memorial Theater, which I still feel good about today, got a little culture. Then, as the invasion was nearing, we went to a city called Devizes, started training some more. My specifics here escape me. And eventually went to the marshalling yards down in Southampton and kind of shipped out of there piecemeal. Some of us left earlier, some left later. I say that I took my first prisoners on June 10th off the beaches of Normandy. Some of the guys say the 20th and 30th when they took them off. But my notes are June 10th off the returning transports and wounded Americans. Went on a landing craft off a net down into a landing barge like in the movies, and went in and got these, and then got the prisoners and put them on these LCTs or something to bring them back. At night, the German, there was limited strafing and so on. Most of us had thrown our gas masks overboard, which I was one of, as excess baggage. And the Germans did throw in what they called a few gas or smoke bombs because they had everything previously set. They knew exactly where they were. Do you want to go on with this for a minute? Okay. And when we were going into Normandy, we were warned not to eat any foods, especially canned goods, not to drink any water out of wells or anything, not to pick up any unexploded shells, which were often very colorful, and not to pick up any souvenirs. And because the danger of shells exploding, booby trapping, and ground glass in the food, and the water being poisoned in the wells. And I was very careful. I learned why we had casualties, because pretty soon people were running up eating canned fruit and the other stuff. We found out soon, we were warned, not to go anywhere near the French civilians or anything, to be very careful going into these towns at night or anything like this, because many of the French people were extremely angry at the Americans. Now, I'll document this with any historian because this is firsthand, no matter what they wrote. And the reason for it was interesting. When we shelled and wiped out these coastal towns and wiped out these cities, we also wiped out families. And I don't know you as a father, but if 4 of your kids were killed by an American shell, you weren't too happy with an American soldier walking into around. Or whether you were married to and had children by a German husband and father, and he was killed or had to leave. And since the Germans had been in Normandy for such a long period of time, they had intermingled and married and even had children and so on. And so there was a lot of harshness and hard feelings about us people coming in there and just blasting into that. And the French really had mixed emotions. You remember North Africa. At North Africa, they had a tendency to fight us too. And so this wasn't totally resolved. And so there were a lot of GIs murdered in Normandy itself because of some of these personal circumstances. Now, I'm not a historian, I didn't count them all, but I know what happened. The other thing we were warned about when we came into Normandy were about the Georgian troops. Now, Georgian troops came from the province of Georgia, Russia. I remember, I'm a dumb kid, I don't know nothing. Except they told us there's going to be Russian soldiers there. They're going to tell you they're friends and they're Ruskies. Forget it. Just take them like all the rest and throw them in a cage, which we did. We had 27 nationalities on the beach in one cage. So when they come up and say, me Ruski, they had a Georgia patch on the thing. The only Georgia I knew was down in southern Wisconsin, the United States. So I was confused. Well, it turned out later on that these were soldiers of fortune, and that they, I think they were called White Russians, I'm not sure. And so we tossed them in the cage with everybody else. We tossed everybody in the cage. That looked suspicious. And we did that all through the war.
So, tell me, what do you mean by cage?
Oh, cages were, when we'd go up to get the prisoners and bring them back from the front and so on, we would bring these prisoners back to an outfit that set up a cage, which was barbed wire usually. And the barbed wire enclosure was so big. And the prisoners we put into these barbed wire enclosures for interrogation and then transferred back and back and back. In the Battle of Mortain, which was shortly after the breakout, we were in the First Army in Normandy. Our company joined the Third Army, then Patton's Third Army. That's where we spent the whole war, then Patton's Third Army. When we went down the coast to join Brittany, there was a counterattack by the Germans in a town called Avranches, August 7th. I remember the date, because I didn't think I'd live to be much older, because my birthday's August 17th. And it was called the Battle of Mortain. It's not a well-known battle, but it's in the history books. And the Germans counterattacked that night. And that night, they sent their planes over, and they strafed our cage, the cage we'd brought the prisoners back to. And we had to release the camp commandant, or released all the prisoners. Told them something like, you can go 200 yards, but you have to return back. Well, it caused mass confusion because the Germans had dropped flares, which we thought were paratroopers. And these Germans were running around on the ground, escaped, released. And so we didn't know what was going on. And some of the soldiers on the ground, of course, shot at some of the prisoners and at each other and everything else. And so that was one of the big confusing nights that we had. That was a cage. After that, I think this is historically documented. They had previously put big white PWs in the center with spotlights on them. I believe after the Battle of Mortain, they stopped doing that. They stopped putting the PWs out, and they turned off the spotlights. Incidentally, the German prisoners begged us to give them the pilots that were shot down that night, which we didn't do. I didn't do. Yeah, they would have torn them, I'm sure, from limb to limb, because they just killed a lot of prisoners that night, strafing the compound. Yeah.
Obviously, the way you described this is when there was a battle that had occurred, the prisoners were taken, you were all called in to come in and haul those prisoners
We were
back.
doing our routine job, just bringing the prisoners back, and we didn't realize at that point that this counterattack was taking place. The first time I knew it was when I saw, the German planes only flew at night. We had Bedcheck Charlie, they called him. He'd come over early in the evening and fly low and look for flares or look for matches or look for anything that they could find. If Bedcheck Charlie found anything, then he'd radio up to the planes higher up, and they'd come down and do whatever they had to do. This particular night, August 7th, I think it was, I looked up with a buddy of mine, Pete Patrick. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I saw a couple of bombers coming over with their black bomb bay doors open, and I knew something was wrong. And then we heard them dropping 2 sticks of bombs, which came relatively close to us. The whoops get heavier as they come closer to you. And we knew something was up, so we went back into the compound. Well, we always bivouacked next to the cage, because that's where we brought the prisoners back to. And so then we knew there was something was up. We just knew what we knew. And then that's when it all started. And so we had brought these prisoners back probably the day before, or maybe earlier that day, and put them in that cage for that night.
Is that where the unit served? Now, did you follow the progression of the war?
Yeah. Our unit always stayed where the fighting was. And
Followed the Third Army.
The Third Army. And different divisions, and fortunately we had a good captain, Captain Lombardi, fortunately is gone now, and he gave us a choice early in the war that and I think most of the guys remember this, that we could go back on rest outfits as a unit. You could be pulled out and go back as a unit. But he warned us that if you went back as a unit, the infantry divisions, which were losing men, could come back and take us as a unit. So we had infantry basic training. And he didn't want to endanger that happening to us. So we had a little bit of an election, like that we would go back individuals more than as a group. So we never pulled out, our unit never pulled out of its sequence during the whole war. We stayed right in the sequence where we were. And in the Battle of the Bulge, it was fortunate, because when we were being busted up to go up to the lines, in the 106th, we already had the patches, so to speak. General Patton's order came through. This is my memory now, I remembered, that he didn't want his service units, or support units busted up, because he expected to turn this thing around any minute, and he wanted to be right back where he was in the first place. That's what we were told.
What would happen to the prisoners after you continued? Who would take over their guarding? I mean,
If they left us, we just dumped them in the cage and they were taken back by somebody else. We never cared and never paid any attention to it. I don't even know where they ended up or what happened to them. I have no idea what happened to them afterwards. I'm sure they went back to larger and bigger camps somewhere in France or somewhere in Germany later on, or England, or maybe, well, early in the war, maybe some back to the States. A little bit of an interesting thing was, after the war ended, I had to spend a great deal of time over in Reims, France, and I won't go into the details as to why, to go to Japan. I was in an outfit called Camp New Orleans near Trier, France, and it was the slogan over the doorway was "On to Tokyo," because I was a young guy and I was cadre to an outfit that just came over. And we got delayed that way. I unfortunately got stuck in a new outfit just sent over there. So what happened was that I didn't get home, as I told you earlier, until late December. And when we were in this camp, in Le Havre camp, they were cigarette camps in those days. You hear that? They called them Philip Morris, Chesterfield, and so on. And I think I was in Camp Philip Morris, Le Havre. And we couldn't go in town anymore because the GIs got so mad watching the German prisoners of war come back off the ships. And we were still sitting over there waiting to come home. And there was a strike at in New York by the dock workers. And the English had taken the Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mary back. And we were kind of thinking, what the hell was this all worth? I mean, boys, you're soon forgotten. If I could say this, almost like sex, you know, I mean, after it's over, forget it. And we felt that way. And then if I could just ad-lib a little personal thing here, the irony of my whole career was that through the efforts of a tough infantry captain, he went out and got mad because we were waiting so long to get a ship. So he got teed off and he went to the commander of the port and demanded that our group, see, you had your groups were just haphazard then. They just pulled so many men together. You could be anything. This group formed groups to go home by points, the point system. And so he got mad, so he got us a ship. And he said, I got you a ship. So damn it, they stuck us on a little Liberty ship called the James Parker. We were supposed to go, we found out later, in the Argentina that sailed 4 days later. Well, the Argentina passed us up on the high seas, and I spent 16 days on the North Atlantic in the worst storm in 40 years on a Liberty ship that we were afraid was cracking up. Its propeller shaft broke, and the guys on board were scared, I could tell. And I thought to myself, and I said, how long do you last in the water up here? And they said, 30 seconds. So kind of, that was almost anticlimactic to my war experience. But we made it home.
In any of the Liberty ships, or in the Liberty ship you were in, were there any American POWs that have been released and brought home? Do you remember?
On Liberty ships?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure.
Your particular ship.
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. I just got on the ship in Le Havre and just went back home on it. Got home 16 days later, and had a semi-happy welcome home. And
when was this? What dates were this?
I got home. I got into New York Harbor. I think it was. I believe it was on the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, December 16th, a year later, 1945. It was a year later. The Battle of the Bulge started on the 16th, and 44, and this was a year later. And I got into Staten Island, New York. Took the Staten Island ferry over to Camp Kilmer. Had ice cream for the first time in my life in 3 years in the Army.
You were demobilized then at that time?
I went back to Fort Sheridan where I started out. And got out December 21st, 1945, and got home for Christmas.
It's been wonderful. Obviously, like I say, learn some things that we normally don't do because of the recordings that we normally do are American POWs. But is there anything else? I can't think of anything else. You've been very enlightening and had a lot of good information to give us.
Well, I've tried to talk to you off the top of my head. I'm sure after I leave I can tell you a million stories. It was an interesting experience for a young guy. I learned a lot. I'm quite active in politics and in anti-war things. I found very much. Let me tell you a little last story if you're still on. When I left high school, those of you out there who see this, if you remember the movie called All Quiet on the Western Front, which I saw as a young child with Lou Ayres, and later it was made by Richard L. Thomas, I think, with Ernest Borgnine. But I saw this movie as a kid, never dreaming that one day I might experience something quite similar to this, not the trench warfare, so to speak, but the frightened, the scaring, and being frightened. And I left high school. I volunteered for the draft, which is something people don't realize. When you reach a certain age, you were tied into the draft, and you couldn't join the service to pick your thing. If you volunteered for the draft, then you could pick where you wanted to go. And I wanted to be in the Navy because we're just 16 miles from Great Lakes up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So I volunteered for the draft to join the Navy, and I went up to Milwaukee to get my physical. And unfortunately, the day I went up there, the quotas for the Navy and Coast Guard were filled, and I didn't want to come home, not join in, so I joined the Army, which was okay, and frankly, it turned out okay. I then left high school. I quit as a senior in my senior year, with the same thing all quiet on the Western Front told us. Somebody's got to do it. Too bad, but nice to go, and hate to see you go, but somebody's got to go. All the administrators and stuff were more or less encouraging. They certainly weren't discouraging. So I left with the idea that when I came home, I would have my high school diploma. Well, approximately 3 years later, I did come home. In January of '46, I went in to pick up my diploma from Kenosha High School. And I walked in and talked to the usual crabby secretaries that work at all high schools, who told me, "What are you talking about? You quit school." I said, "Yeah, but I quit. But they told me I'd get my diploma." "Well, you have to talk to the principal." Well, in the meantime, the two principals that had been there when I left had died, believe it or not. So I went into I won't name him, but to the principal I had never liked in the first place, who had been an assistant principal. And he sat me down and he said, "What are you here for?" And I said, "To pick up my diploma." And he said, "You didn't finish school. You didn't take Phi Ed 2 and something 3. I said, "I know, but they told me I could come and pick it up." And here are the famous words that always made me angry about war, and I've never forgotten them. "We don't keep the promises of past administrations." And I knew right then, young man, that back home, nobody really knew what was going on. And I've really learned that since. I'm not saying this that went through hardship, because my war experiences, I was in the right place at the right time. And I'm thankful that I got to be in a combat type experience, but I still didn't, lose my life, and I didn't have to be up in the front constantly or anything. But it taught me a lot about life, and one of the reasons I think I went into psychology. But ever since then, I've realized through my interest that people have to realize the horror of war. And you working down in Andersonville, obviously, know from the history down there how awful it was. So I'm a great campaigner, and on this tape, for whatever it's worth, I think everything should be settled. And the war has nothing to do with the little guy. I was a little guy, and I was with the little guys for many years, for a couple of years, and neither one of us were nothing more than friends. And it's kind of ironic to be in a situation where a guy could kill you 10 minutes before